In the fall of 1987, Keith and Elaine Dardeen were doing everything they could to create a quiet, safe life for their growing family. Originally from Mount Carmel, Illinois, the couple were high school sweethearts, bonded not only by love, but by shared values and a deep-rooted belief in living a simple, grounded life. They weren't chasing wealth or status. Instead, they were chasing stability, peace, and the kind of environment where their children could grow up surrounded by love and protection. Their decision to move to rural Jefferson County, near the small town of Ina, was deliberate. The area was quiet, the farmland expansive, and the cost of living low enough to allow them to get by on a modest income. Keith had secured a job working long shifts on an oil rig, a physically demanding and often exhausting occupation, but one that provided enough for their needs. Elaine, meanwhile, stayed home to raise their son Peter, a bright and energetic 2.5-year-old boy who was the center of their world. She was also pregnant, just weeks away from giving birth to their second child. They made their home in a small mobile trailer situated on leased farmland. It wasn't luxurious by any means. There was no white picket fence, no manicured lawn, but the trailer was clean, well-kept, and filled with warmth. Photographs of Peter, toys neatly tucked away, and little signs of care were all over the home. It was a place where love outweighed material possessions. It was also a home marked by vigilance. Keith, by all accounts, was extremely cautious. He had a keen awareness of the world's dangers, perhaps more so than most young fathers. Stories had circulated in the area about rising drug use and creeping violence, even in rural pockets that once seemed untouched by such things. Keith was determined to shield his family from it all. He rarely let anyone he didn't know near their trailer. He would not open the door unless he recognized the voice or face outside. In fact, neighbors recalled that just a few weeks before the murders, Keith had turned away a man who asked to use their phone, refusing to let a stranger into their home under any circumstance. This protective instinct was not paranoia. It was responsibility. Elaine shared his instincts. Together, they had recently started attending a local Baptist church in Ina. The goal was to plant deeper roots in the community, to find support, spiritual guidance, and hopefully connect with people who valued decency and faith as they did. They weren't naive. They knew the world was far from perfect, but they believed in doing their part to live rightly, to raise their children with honesty, discipline, and love. Their lives, though unassuming, were rich in the ways that mattered most. Family dinners, bedtime stories for Peter, preparing for the arrival of the new baby. All of these moments built a quiet but beautiful foundation. The Dardeens were not flashy, not boastful. They kept to themselves, worked hard, and tried to do good. They were, in many ways, the embodiment of the American dream in its most modest form, a young couple working together to create a better future for their children. That's what made what happened next so jarring, so incomprehensible. There was no shadow of conflict, no known enemies, no secret criminal ties or dark family drama. By every outward measure, they were the kind of family people respected, loving, decent, and careful. The community saw them that way. Friends described Keith as a quiet, responsible man and Elaine as a devoted mother. Peter, with his big eyes and curious nature, was adored by everyone who met him. And so, when the Dardeens vanished from their daily routine without warning, concern quickly turned to panic. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, because this was not a family that took chances or played with fire. They lived a peaceful life, built carefully, brick by brick, with intention and humility, which is why the brutality they would ultimately suffer, and the utter senselessness of it, left not just their loved ones, but an entire county shaken to its core. On November 18, 1987, concern quickly turned into horror when Keith Dardeen failed to show up for his evening shift at the oil rig. He was known to be reliable and responsible, so his unexplained absence alarmed his coworkers. When police arrived at the Dardeen family's trailer to check on them, they found the door locked from the outside, which was already suspicious. Upon forcing entry, they discovered a gruesome scene that would haunt even the most seasoned investigators. Inside the small, quiet home, Elaine Dardeen was found bludgeoned to death with a baseball bat while in the final stages of pregnancy. In the midst of the attack, she had gone into labor and given birth. Tragically, the newborn baby, still attached to the umbilical cord, was also brutally murdered shortly after being born. Nearby, the couple's 2-year-old son Peter was found beaten to death in the same brutal fashion. The bat used in the murders was identified as one Keith had recently bought for his son. The sheer cruelty and intimate violence of the crime shocked the entire community. The trailer was not ransacked, nothing was stolen, and there was no sign of forced entry, making the motive and the perpetrator even more mysterious. The shockwaves from the gruesome discovery inside the Dardeen family's modest trailer had barely begun to settle when a second, equally chilling revelation deepened the mystery and horror. In the immediate aftermath of finding Elaine Dardeen, their 2-year-old son Peter and the newborn baby brutally murdered inside their locked mobile home, investigators were left with a glaring question: where was Keith Dardeen? His sudden disappearance led some to suspect that he may have fled after killing his family in a fit of madness. It was a theory not uncommon in the early stages of homicide investigations involving multiple family members, particularly when no forced entry or theft could be identified. But for those who knew Keith, the quiet, responsible, cautious young man who doted on his wife and children, the thought was nearly impossible to accept. Still, the absence of his body and the calculated, methodical nature of the murders left the horrifying possibility open in the minds of investigators. That is, until the following day. On the morning of November 19, 1987, just one day after the discovery of the carnage inside the Dardeen trailer, a local farmer stumbled upon something strange in his wheat field, a sight so out of place in the quiet farmland of Jefferson County that it gave him pause. It was the body of a man. Alarmed, he immediately contacted law enforcement. When deputies arrived, they found the body of Keith Dardeen lying in the dirt, not far from the trailer that had once held the home he had built for his family. The location was just a mile away, close enough to suggest that Keith had been killed not long after being separated from his loved ones, but far enough that his body had gone unnoticed during the initial search of the area. What police found confirmed what many in the community had feared but dared not say aloud. Keith Dardeen had not killed his family. He had been murdered too, and in a manner that was gruesome, deliberate, and deeply personal. Keith's body bore 3 gunshot wounds to the head, a clear execution-style killing. But more horrifying was the fact that he had also been mutilated after death. His genitals had been severed. This savage act of post-mortem mutilation spoke to a level of hatred or rage that didn't match any rational motive. It wasn't random violence. It was something deeper, something crueler. The specific nature of the mutilation ruled out any remaining suspicion that Keith had been responsible for the deaths of his family. A man who had killed his wife, son, and newborn baby in such brutal fashion would not have ended his own life in a field a mile away, let alone gone to the extent of mutilating himself post-mortem. The wounds were inflicted by someone else, and that someone had managed to murder 4 people across 2 locations without leaving behind any clear evidence or trail. With Keith's body now found and examined, any doubts about his innocence were erased. He, too, was a victim of the same horrifying violence that had claimed his entire family. This discovery reframed the case entirely. Authorities now had to abandon the idea of a murder-suicide and accept a far more chilling reality. A ruthless killer or killers had descended upon the Dardeen family with the sole purpose of annihilation. But why? What had this small, devout, cautious family done to warrant such an unimaginable fate? There were no answers. There were no leads. What was left was a broken community, shattered trust, and a growing sense of panic that something evil had passed through their midst and could return at any time. The discovery of Keith's body also presented a logistical mystery. How had the killer managed to subdue Keith, separate him from his family, and lead or force him out into a remote field? Had Keith been taken hostage first, forced to watch as his wife and children were slaughtered, and then executed as an afterthought, or as the main target of some deeply personal vendetta? Or had he simply come home to find his family already dead, only to be overpowered before he could react? These questions tormented investigators, and the lack of clear answers only intensified their desperation. If the killer was someone the Dardeens had known, it made no sense. Keith had been vigilant about strangers, protective of his family, and skeptical of anyone he didn't trust. He had once refused to let a stranger use the house phone, and he never opened the door without knowing who was on the other side. He had even warned Elaine not to answer the door if he wasn't home. So, how had the killer gotten inside? How had they gained control? Adding another layer to the confusion was the fact that Keith had been dressed when his body was found, but there were signs of a struggle. His hands showed marks that suggested he had been restrained at some point. Yet there was no indication that he had been killed at the same time as the others. The sequencing of the murders was unclear. It seemed as though the killer had gone out of their way to psychologically torment the family, separating Keith from his wife and children before killing him in an entirely different manner. While Elaine and the children had been beaten to death with a baseball bat, an intensely violent, intimate, and frenzied act, Keith had been shot. That distinction puzzled law enforcement. Was the killer using different methods to deliver a message? Did they have a particular hatred for Keith and a different, equally twisted disdain for Elaine and the children? The field where Keith's body was found yielded little in the way of evidence. There were no tire tracks, no footprints, no shell casings. It was as if he had been dropped there from the sky. The remoteness of the location offered few chances for witnesses. It was farmland, open and quiet, far from the nearest house or roadway. Whoever had killed Keith had done so with terrifying efficiency and with enough confidence to believe they could get away with it. And they did. Keith's murder not only cleared his name, but destroyed the community's sense of safety. If someone as careful and cautious as Keith Dardeen could be lured or forced into a situation that led to the destruction of his entire family, then no one was truly safe. The people of Ina, Illinois, locked their doors tighter. They bought guns. They stopped answering the door for strangers. The Dardeen family had followed every rule of safety, and it hadn't saved them. In the months that followed, investigators worked tirelessly to piece together Keith's final hours. They traced his last known movements, spoke to his coworkers, and combed through phone records and receipts. They tried to determine who might have had access to the trailer or who could have known the Dardeens' routines. But nothing pointed to a clear suspect. The randomness of the crime, and the contrast between the brutal bludgeoning of Elaine and the children versus the calculated execution of Keith, defied easy explanation. Theories abounded. A drifter, a serial killer, a satanic cult, a vengeful acquaintance. But there was no evidence to support any of them. Keith had no known enemies. He was a gentle, family-oriented man who worked hard and stayed out of trouble. He wasn't involved in drugs, gambling, or infidelity. His co-workers respected him. His neighbors liked him. His life was ordinary in the best of ways. And then, it was over, erased in one of the most baffling crimes Southern Illinois had ever seen. The mutilation of Keith's body, particularly the severing of his genitals, continued to haunt investigators and criminal profilers alike. It was a deeply symbolic act, one that often suggests a desire to degrade, emasculate, or dominate the victim even after death. In some cases, such mutilation can be sexually motivated or rooted in jealousy, rage, or psychological disturbance. In others, it's ritualistic or meant to send a message. But what message had the killer been trying to send? And to whom? No one could say. The mutilation only deepened the psychological horror of the case. Whoever had done this was not just a killer. They were a sadist. They wanted to destroy not just a man, but his entire legacy, his family, his future, his memory. In the years that followed, the image of Keith Dardeen's body lying in that field became a symbol of everything that made this case so terrifying. It wasn't just the brutality. It was the mystery, the unanswered questions, the fear that it could happen again, and the devastating truth that Keith had died not only a victim but, for a time, under the shadow of suspicion. It took the discovery of his mutilated body to finally clear his name. In death, he could no longer defend himself. But the facts had done it for him. He had fought, he had suffered, and in the end, he had died not as a perpetrator, but as a father and husband who had tried, perhaps unsuccessfully, to protect his family from a horror that defies understanding. To this day, the field where Keith was found holds a grim significance for the people of Jefferson County. It marks the end of a life and the deepening of a mystery that would never truly be solved. Keith's murder, so personal and so violent, turned the Dardeen case from a family tragedy into one of the darkest and most inexplicable mass killings in American history. The violence committed against him still stands as one of the most unnerving indicators of the killer's mindset: cold, cruel, and calculated. And yet, despite the horror, Keith Dardeen's memory has been reclaimed. In his community, among the people who knew him, and in the telling of this story, he is remembered not for how he died, but for how he lived, as a devoted husband, a protective father, and an innocent man whose life was cut short by evil beyond comprehension. One of the most confounding aspects of the Dardeen family murders was the complete absence of any clear motive or evidence pointing to why such a brutal and devastating crime had occurred. When investigators first arrived at the scene, they expected to find some indication of what had triggered this horrifying act, some clue that would help them piece together the sequence of events, identify a suspect, or at least understand the killer's intent. But instead, they were met with a bewildering silence. There was no sign of forced entry into the locked trailer. The doors had been securely fastened from the inside, suggesting that the killer, or killers, either had a key, were let inside willingly, or possessed the kind of knowledge and skill to bypass locks without leaving a trace. Yet, no neighbors or witnesses reported any unusual visitors or suspicious activity in the days leading up to the murders. This lack of forced entry suggested the family might have known their attacker, or at least did not fear them enough to bar them from entering, but that led to more questions than answers. Equally puzzling was the absence of robbery. Nothing valuable appeared to have been taken. The family's possessions remained untouched. There was no sign of a struggle over money or belongings, no indication that theft had been the motive. The murder seemed gratuitous rather than opportunistic, an attack not driven by financial gain or desperation, but by something far darker. Nor was there any evidence of sexual assault. Although Elaine was found bludgeoned to death while in labor, a moment of vulnerability that would make any person's mind reel with horror, investigators found no signs that the killer had sexually violated her or any of the victims. The mutilation of Keith's body stood apart as a separate act of cruelty, but it did not suggest a sexual motive in the traditional sense. This absence only deepened the mystery, ruling out a common motive often seen in violent family murders. Perhaps most baffling of all was the killer's apparent cleanliness. No fingerprints, no DNA, no footprints, or any forensic trace that could lead back to them. It was as if the perpetrator had vanished into thin air, leaving behind a scene soaked in violence, but devoid of any forensic breadcrumbs. This careful avoidance of leaving evidence pointed to a killer who was either experienced, methodical, or chillingly indifferent to the destruction they wrought. It suggested planning, cold calculation, and a terrifying level of control. Yet, despite the overwhelming personal nature of the violence, the beating of Elaine with a baseball bat, the murder of the newborn baby moments after birth, the brutal beating of young Peter, and the execution-style killing and mutilation of Keith, the Dardeen family had no known enemies. No disputes, no threats, no grudges, no signs of domestic violence or conflict. Their lives had been quiet, simple, and deeply religious, focused on family and safety. The couple had moved to the area seeking exactly that: peace and security in a modest, rural community. They were cautious, wary of strangers, and careful with whom they trusted. Their reputations were untarnished. This absence of motive made the murders feel all the more senseless and terrifying. The violence was extreme and intimate, suggesting hatred or rage, yet it targeted a family who seemed to have done nothing to deserve such a fate. This paradox haunted investigators and the community alike. How could such an ordinary, peaceful family be destroyed so utterly and without warning? The randomness of the crime tore through the fabric of the community, leaving everyone on edge. If the Dardeens had no enemies, no conflicts, and no signs of trouble, then was anyone truly safe? Was this a random act of cruelty by a stranger with no connection to the family, or was there some hidden truth buried beneath the surface that no one could see? The silence of the evidence and the lack of motive turned the case into an enigma, a puzzle that refused to be solved. In the end, this lack of clear motive or evidence became one of the defining features of the Dardeen murders. It made the case cold, impenetrable, and deeply unsettling. It reminded everyone involved that sometimes violence strikes not because of who the victims are or what they have done, but simply because of the darkest impulses of human nature, impulses that defy logic, reason, and explanation. And for the Dardeen family, that cruel, inexplicable fate would forever remain a haunting mystery. The shocking brutality of the Dardeen family murders sent ripples of fear and panic throughout the small rural town of Ina, Illinois. This was not just another crime to be noted in the police reports or whispered about in passing. It was a violent rupture in the very heart of the community's sense of safety and normalcy. Ina was a quiet place where neighbors knew each other, children played freely in backyards, and doors were often left unlocked. The horror that unfolded in the Dardeen trailer shattered that fragile peace, replacing it with suspicion, anxiety, and an overwhelming sense of vulnerability. Almost immediately after the discovery of the murders, parents began to keep their children home from school. The thought of sending their kids into classrooms, playgrounds, and neighborhoods now haunted by such a senseless tragedy was unbearable. The streets that once echoed with laughter and friendly greetings fell silent or buzzed with cautious whispers. Playdates, family gatherings, and community events were canceled or attended with a watchful, wary eye. Local law enforcement increased patrols, but their presence was more a gesture of reassurance than a guarantee of safety. The realization that the killer was still at large and that the murders appeared motiveless and random only amplified the community's fear. If a peaceful, religious family like the Dardeens could be wiped out in their own home with such savage cruelty, then no one was truly safe. Gun sales in Ina surged as residents sought to protect themselves in any way possible. Families who had never owned firearms suddenly found themselves buying handguns and rifles, attending shooting courses, and setting up elaborate home security systems. The underlying message was clear. If the police couldn't stop the killer, then people had to take their safety into their own hands. This shift marked a dark turning point for the town, from a trusting rural community to one gripped by paranoia and defensiveness. The murders cast a long shadow over Ina for years. Every unexplained noise at night, every stranger passing through town, became a potential threat. Neighborhoods became tight-knit enclaves of vigilance, with residents watching each other's backs but also wondering who among them might be capable of such violence. The uncertainty and unanswered questions fueled rumors, speculation, and fear, making it difficult for the town to heal. Despite the passage of time, the case remained unsolved. The absence of a clear motive, a suspect, or even forensic evidence turned the investigation into a cold case, one that haunted detectives and the community alike. The killer seemed to have vanished, leaving behind only a legacy of devastation and dread. For the people of Ina, the Dardeen murders were more than a crime. They were a loss of innocence and a reminder that darkness could lurk beneath the most peaceful of surfaces. The town's collective fear lingered long after the news cameras left, shaping how residents lived, interacted, and viewed their once safe world. It was a chilling chapter that marked Ina forever, a wound that time could not easily heal. Despite the passage of decades, the brutal murders of the Dardeen family remain one of Illinois' most haunting and unresolved crimes. The pain and loss felt by the community of Ina never fully faded, as questions lingered and justice remained out of reach. Though the conviction and execution of Tommy Lynn Sells brought some hope for closure, the lingering doubts and lack of definitive proof left a shadow over the case. No other suspects have emerged, no new evidence has surfaced, and the chilling mystery of who perpetrated such unimaginable cruelty endures. The Dardeens are remembered not only for the horrific way their lives were taken, but for the ordinary, hopeful lives they led, lives rooted in love, faith, and family. Their story stands as a stark reminder of the fragile nature of safety and the darkness that can invade even the most peaceful places. It also serves as a solemn call for vigilance, compassion, and the pursuit of truth, no matter how elusive it may be. The trailer where the massacre occurred was eventually removed, and the land returned to quiet use, but the echoes of that tragic night linger in the memories of those who knew the Dardeens and those who heard their story. The case remains officially open, a cold file waiting for new leads or breakthroughs, but the hope for answers dims with each passing year. In the end, the Dardeen family's legacy is one of enduring love overshadowed by senseless violence. Their memory calls us to never forget the human cost behind the headlines and to continue seeking justice for victims whose stories remain unfinished.